Hello and welcome to part 2 of episode 50, Firelight in the Darkness. This is a discussion on how we are made in God's image and really a way to look at God in a completely consumable and understandable way that is both biblically accurate and scientifically sound. This may sound like a big secret, and to a lot of people it is. That's because the Bible is being systematically destroyed, and the validity of the Bible's story is deliberately excommunicated from all forms of official documentation, science, representation, media presentation, and definitely official recognition. Yet, the light and the truth of the Bible is like a firelight in the darkness. It really cannot be hidden. And if you want to see it, if you want to open your eyes, it will be as plain as day, as when God said, "Let there be light," and he saw that it was good. So in this second installment of Firelight in the Darkness, we're going to start off by reminding people that you are an entity. You are a being, a sentient being made entirely of energy, and that all of the cells that are in your body are less than 7 years old, or maybe just barely 7 years old. So if you're 30, all of the cells in your body have been replaced at least 3 times and are working on 4 or more times. So you are a continuous entity made up of living things that have died and been replaced by their ancestors. In addition, all of the cells in your body are outnumbered by the bacteria that preys upon, that is a parasite to your body, and yet is also essential for life. And we are in a place that God created, which is a very small sliver of the energy level of the universe. We in the visible light spectrum, we are couched in this less than 0.1% of all of what is actually out there in terms of what we can recognize and see with our own senses. And yet here we are, sentient beings made of energy, made up of smaller living things that have been replaced by generations, and yet here we are. You can still hear this message. Your life on earth began when the sperm connected with the egg, and at that moment, a part of the Spirit of God was given to you as your spirit. And in that same instant, your soul was born as a record of God's Spirit in the body, as controlled by you, the soul, the entity at the controls. And from that inception to this present moment that you're hearing me, you are driving the bus, and you are occupied by a portion of the Spirit of God. You are your own soul, and both the Spirit and the soul are inside this temporal body that will be replaced in your next life. So that is your Trinity, right? That is one of the many ways in which you are made in God's image. But here's another way. You are made up of smaller living things that live and die in generational cycles. And just like God is the sum total of all things, for the cells in your body and the bacteria that is dependent upon you, you as an individual are the universe by which those smaller living things depend. Now, can you imagine 2 of your blood cells having a conversation about whether or not you as an individual actually existed? And one says to the other, "How can you prove that Mary exists or Nancy exists, because I cannot see her?" Right? All I can see is the stuff that's immediately around me. And yet, that conversation might continue through the generations of all the blood cells that you've ever had. And in the same way, again, you are made in God's image. In the same way, you are a child of God. And obviously, He created you for a reason. You may not know that reason or those reasons, but I would call your attention to some of the smaller details, like the impact that you've had on the lives of others. Positive, negative. They all have use in God's perfect plan. And you're not to, I think, try to understand the absolute depth of those, because you'd spend all your time trying to figure that out. But if you can recognize at least a few times in your life where you've had a positive impact on other people, and also a negative impact, you'll realize that you played a part in their decision making, which is really the purpose for them, as well as your own purpose. So, like every blade of grass is really connected by the soil, no matter where it is on the planet, then, every person is connected in this global community. And I'm not a globalist, but I'm saying that in the same sense, we are all connected. And we share not just the ground we walk on, but the spaces between us, in which it seems like certain types of communication happen with or without our knowledge and or participation. However, it turns out, eventually, you are born, and you come into this world, hopefully. You don't end up in a Planned Parent clinic and have your life ended, months after it started. But if you end up, having parents who want to have you as their child and raise you either poorly or well or kind of meh, however that turns out, eventually you're given the reins and control of your own life. And then there are immediately decisions to make from the very earliest ages, right? And those decisions never stop until the time that your eyes close and your time here ends and you go on to, the next life. And hopefully that next life isn't outside the body of God. Because like being outside the body of your mother, being outside the body of God is wrought with peril. And in the next life, being outside the body of God has no positive possibility. You are in the place of 50-50 mix here and now, and this place is sort of the kindergarten, and the Bible is sort of the player's handbook to navigating this life and to coming to the place where you've made a decision. And assuming that you've had the appropriate amount of time by God's estimation, whatever decision you have is basically based upon your preference. And that preference will guide where you end up and what happens to you from there on out. As we all know, the world is filled with a full spectrum of possibilities when it comes to human beings. Some people are very selfless, giving, loving, caring, and derive joy from being good to other people. And then there's the other end of the spectrum. And people who exist on that darker end of the spectrum aren't filled with the light of God. They're filled with their own evil intention and desire, because that's where they fit in on that part of the spectrum. And that's just how they navigate through life. So they don't clamor towards the light. They try to gather all the temporal things found in the darkness. And they do this by whatever means possible, because they have elected not to live under the house rules of God. And I've met people who know that God exists and have told me to my face that they prefer their sin. I don't understand that, really. I don't understand how you can knowingly trade forever for just a little while. And I think the desperation of these individuals gets more and more divergent and more conspicuous as they gain age and time. They realize that all the things that they have, the entire basket that they've placed all of their eggs in is rapidly going away. Their life passes, as all of our lives do, surprisingly fast. And as they get older, they get more and more desperate, clamoring for that opportunity to fill the emptiness that only a relationship with God can, because inherently, at your core, you understand that you are a mortal being. And being mortal, you also understand that, there's this thing, this relationship that you don't have with evil that you could have with God, that only God can fill that space. And so you're seeing a collective realization occur now, where people are, no matter what end of the spectrum of possibilities you find yourself on, people are realizing, like, okay, this is starting to wind down, and pretty soon it's going to come to a head. And then whatever's next, that's on deck. And that whatever depends entirely upon your preference, your faith, and the knowledge that you've acquired in accordance with your preference and your faith. As we approach these later days, you're going to see the formulation of what the Bible calls the Great Deception. And it's a means by which to further lie to those people who have fooled themselves with the tendency to not have a preference towards God. And it'll be a way to convince them to not only not accept the grace given to them by Jesus Christ through God, but also a way to actually find themselves enemies of God. And you're hearing a lot about it, last year and this year. And you're going to hear a lot more about it as this year winds on. Demons in the Bible are described as frog-like beings, and that there really is no good in them. They don't have a spirit of God because they were not created by God's authority. They were created through the rebellion of angels, and so they're not a Trinity. They are only binary. They have their own soul, and they have the body. And because they have no spirit of God in them, there is no good in them. Now, I'm not a demonologist, and I do not claim to have all of the knowledge of demons that, in terms of names and origins and all of these other things. But I can tell you what the Bible says about them. And I can tell you that lining up with the Great Deception is this idea that creatures came from some other planet. When the truth is, it looks like these things have always been here. And they don't need to come from another planet when you exist in a reality where you can't see 99.9% of what is in front of you. You can't see it. You cannot see into the infrared or ultraviolet spectrums. You can't, detect anything in the X-ray band or the gamma ray band of energy and reality. Those places are blind spots to you. Imagine a creature lived in that space would be invisible to you until such time as they chose to or were able to show themselves. This is what spirits and demons and all these other ghost-like apparitions and, entities are, and where they are, really, more importantly. They've always been here. And there doesn't need to be another planet for them to come to. It doesn't make any sense anyway. I mean, let's say these guys are aliens and they're from another planet. So they come here in the 1950s with technology that's supposedly thousands of years old, and they crash 13 times in 1 year. That makes no sense, right? And why would they just sort of linger here, experimenting on cows, ad nauseum? None of that makes any sense. So I think their purpose is to cause fear and to get you to look away from God and to ponder things that are absurd, really, when you just look at the basic energetics requirement for space travel. And it's much easier and much more doable in a scientific sense to simply step through from one energy phase in the same location to another. It's not a mistake, perhaps, that in 1948, the ownership, manufacture, or operation of an electromagnetic field generator was made illegal. And it's not a mistake that that's the same technology that allegedly turned a ship invisible, an Eldridge, the USS Eldridge, a Philadelphia-class destroyer, in the thing called the Philadelphia experiment. So, I wasn't there. I don't know what occurred or how it occurred, but I do know that in 1948, Congress made it illegal to own, operate, or construct an electromagnetic field generator, and that technology would be the precise tool in which you could navigate these other unseen fields with some precision. If, again, in that same period of time, it had been put underground and studied with a lot of that money that disappeared from the United States government. So what does electromagnetic field manipulation have to do with the world we live in today? Maybe a lot of things. Hypothetically speaking, you could be talking about things like the Mandela effect. You could be talking about, the ability to manipulate events before or after they occurred. These are all hypotheticals. I don't know that technology exists. I do know that it's extremely likely that if, electromagnetic drives exist, they could propel any object of any weight in any direction very quickly, just like a much smaller and much less technologically advanced system can propel an entire train with all of its weight, floating above the rails that it's traveling on, being propelled by an electronic circuit that has to slow the train to the massive speeds that it's traveling. So if that exists, then imagine what would happen if you took that technology driven underground in 1948 and it had the same or even a greater rate of technological advancement that computers have had in the last 25 years. Right? Because 1948 was 73 years ago. So there's all kinds of possibilities out there. I'm telling you that, in my opinion, a lot of this technology has been driven underground for the express purpose of creating a deception to turn people's eyes away from God and let them believe what they want to believe. And some of them want to believe that aliens are real, and I think maybe they are, but I wouldn't call them aliens. I think alien is an accurate term, but not in a sense that most people understand. I think they are alien to our understanding of what good and evil is, because they don't really care about good. They don't have any good in them. And you see that in some people, right? Like the Ted Bundys of the world. They can kind of hide in plain sight. They know what and who they are, and they know enough to hide themselves. But at the same time, they really cannot escape their true nature. And really, none of us can. So what if you find yourself this person who really kind of does understand everything I just said, and maybe understood it before I said it, but you still feel like you're sort of disconnected from God, like there's a distance or a gap or a gulf between you and Him. And some of you might say, or her. I will only say this regarding gender. God calls Himself He and Him. So it really doesn't matter, because even in heaven, all of us are not given in marriage the way we are here on earth. Gender is really not an issue. So for the people who like to use that as a measure of divisiveness and division, remember that that's really the purpose for all of these isms and, racism, sexism, and all the rest of it. They are measures by which we divide ourselves from each other. And when you consider that loving your neighbor is equal to loving yourself and second only to loving God, you can see that that's a weapon of the enemy, and that division is one of the enemy's greatest tools. So don't let yourself get all wrapped up in that, because all you're really doing is allowing the enemy of God to separate you from God by separating you from your brothers and sisters. So don't get caught up in that, first of all. Second of all, the gap, the gulf between you and God can be bridged instantaneously by your preference. I'm going to say that again. It's a distance of maybe 100 miles or 1,000 miles or 1,000,000 miles, but with one step, you get there immediately. And that is through preference. Preference precedes faith, faith precedes knowledge, and knowledge precedes certainty. So all you have to do is say, I can see that there's evil in the world. And I can see that it seems to be super biblically based. It's not like it's, opposed to every religion on the sun. It really seems to be a Judeo-Christian opposition. And you could possibly include the Islamic faith there, because it is, Islam is a Judeo-Christian derivative. So, why does it always seem to oppose that faith-based system? Well, that's because that is the true faith, and the opposition to it knows it, right? All these other religions, and maybe not all of them, but most of them, are not derivatives of the Judeo-Christian belief system, and therefore they are not openly opposed by the evil powers of the world, because they are in no way a threat. Your faith comes after your preference. If you want to be with God, then you step towards faith, that one step, and you're there. I know that sounds simplistic, and it really is. When you listen to biographies of people who are super successful in life, the one difference between a very successful person who works hard and a very unsuccessful person who works just as hard is belief. And belief comes from preference. Now, they both have the preference. They both want to be wealthy and successful. But one believes they can do it and believes they will do it, and the other one does not. And that's the difference. It's that step from your preference, where you want to go, to where you find yourself. And that is a leap of faith. And it'll take you over any distance. The universe, of course, is a very large place. And being large and being very difficult, if not impossible, to fully comprehend, understand that the universe is expanding into a place that the Bible calls outer darkness. And it's doing so at an exponential rate. So I want to be very clear about something that is deliberately not made clear. When they did the redshift measurements initially, and they said, the universe is 14.5 or 14.6 billion years old, when they did this redshift measurement, they saw that there was movement, and they made the assumption that the planet or whatever it was that was moving with the star in the background, and they saw this redshift occur, and they said, there's something moving there. There is expansion. They made the assumption that expansion was a deceleration from the Big Bang, because that's what they believed in. So they sort of, they had what's called confirmation bias, right? They believed it before they actually observed it enough to understand what was happening. A second, later measurement showed that not only was the universe expanding at an accelerating rate, but a rapidly, maybe exponentially accelerating rate. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you're going to expand the universe, and you're going to do so very slowly from, let's say, a Big Bang, then yeah, it makes sense that the universe is really old, because it takes a long time to get back to the point of explosion. But if the universe is expanding at a seriously accelerating rate, you get back to the beginning very quickly, right? It's not even 1 billion. It's not even 1 million. It's not even 100,000 years. It's a fraction of 100,000 years. And if we compare that to all the other observations we can make, like the number of supernovae that explode over a period of time, We're looking at about 26,000 years for the whole ball of wax. For everything that we can see in the universe is about 26,000 years old, if you take things like that into consideration. And on the planet that we live on, if you throw out the highly inaccurate and highly, by orders of 5,000% inaccurate isotope related measurements, and you use very accurate measurements like the dissipation of the Earth's electromagnetic field or the accumulation of atmospheric dust and a bunch of other different things, you realize that the Earth is very, very young. And that means, it's an indicator that those other observations are accurate. And by that I mean those that say that the universe is very young. So, take that all into consideration when people start saying, well, billions and billions and zillions and millions and thousands of hundreds of thousands of years ago. They have no idea what they're talking about. And the science that we already have in our hand proves that. You can keep in mind things like we have many fossils with soft tissue in the middle of these large bones, and you're going to have scientists tell you that the bones are 65, 120 million years old, and yet there's soft, squishy tissue in the middle of them. If you believe that, I've got a few bridges for sale, and I will give you a very good price on that. No, this gigantic Milky Way that we can only see 1/10 of 1% of. Look at that picture and realize that all that stuff in there is only 1/10 of 1% of what is out there. That's right, because that's all we can see with our senses. We have to use a huge spectrum of other technologies and put them all together like layers. And then we might begin to see that we're inside of a body. And that body belongs to God. And outside that body is outer darkness. Now you have a body, and maybe this is the cell of, this is the view that your cells have of the body. Who knows, right? I'm just saying hypothetically. And we go back to those two red blood cells having this conversation about your body, and they look out and they say, I don't see Bob or Mike or Richie out there. I just see all these little dots and some gas. Well, who knows how limited the view is from there. And I'm not saying that these blood cells can have a conversation, but you understand that what I'm saying is I'm illustrating to you that you are a sentient being made entirely of energy. And a lot of the energy in different states isn't alive. Like, if we took all the iron out of your body, you would die. If we took all the magnesium out of your body, you would die. If we took all the potassium out of your body, you would die. If we took all the hydrogen out of your body, you would die. And yet none of these things are individually alive. Collectively, though, there is some kind of spirit in this machinery that needs those entities, those items, to exist. And the same people who say they don't believe in God could tell you that everything I just said was true. And yet they don't think that it's possible for the sum total of all things to be a body and to be sentient and to be alive. Which, of course, is really ignorant of the science that they proclaim, right? They proclaim to be these super scientific individuals, and yet they make the most obvious and easily understood and immediately recognizable mistakes that they can't see because their preference blinds them. And let's talk a little bit about that. The scientific method. Observable, repeatable, verifiable. Let's take a look at that, right? The more you get into science, which I definitely am into science, the more you recognize that the definition of words really, really, really matter. It's not just conversational idioms and differences in expression, but the meanings which create an ideological corral and really an ideological prison. Let's back up to the reality that we can only see 1/10 of 1% of what is in the world, And they start off the scientific method by saying observable, which means they don't want you to see anything more than that 1/10 of 1%. And then repeatable. Well, of course, in repetition, if you want to learn how to play the piano, or tie your shoes, or say the word the, or your own name, or write a letter, you have to repeat this over and over again. This is how you are programmed. So, observable, limited, repeatable, programming, verifiable, social pressure to accept the programming. And that is the scientific method. And it's deliberately ignoring the other 99.9%. They don't want you to see what's behind the curtain. There's nothing back there. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Because the man behind the curtain calls himself God, and his opposition is not on his side. Now, if you're an atheist, leftist, if you're a humanist or a Satanist, you're going to be saying, like, he's saying not to pay attention to science. No, I'm saying that science is at least 99.9% deficient as currently defined, because that is the percentage by which we're ignoring in terms of observable. So we can't verify it, and we can't repeat it if we never observe it to begin with. And that is the prison of the definition of the scientific method. The scientific method needs to be reworded so that it includes the other 99.9% of the entire rest of the world that is out there. And it might be more than that, but we know for sure it's at least that much more. And we are not looking at it at all. And that's my point. So for all the whack job leftists and all these people who are so drunk on the leftist godless Kool-Aid, let me wake you up to the reality that you are being led down a primrose path, just like the 10th cow in the line to be slaughtered. Because what's at stake here, and that's stake being kind of a deliberate pun, thank you, the crux of this whole issue is that you have something that the enemy wants. And why do they want your immortal soul? There's no way they're going to beat God, right? Like, that would be like one of your blood cells waging war against you. And maybe they can spread a cancer inside of you, but if you're God and you can immediately cure cancer, you get the point. So, but what they can do is they can kill a lot of cells, right? They can kill a lot of us by taking away our immortal souls. And that is the only measure by which Lucifer can measure victory, is the number of God's children he can take from him. Now, you really need to understand the book of Enoch, which I'm not going to get into right now, except to say that it describes how God forced the fallen angels to watch the destruction of their children that they created to lord over and to destroy the children of God. God forced them to watch their own children destroy each other before he put them in bounds, and before he locked them away. And the spirits of those entities are being called aliens, those entities that destroyed each other in a previous life. They don't have a spirit, and they're not going to rest in the earth to await judgment day. When they die, their soul just kind of goes out without a body, and it looks for places to occupy. And this is what people call shadows and ghosts and poltergeists and entities and demons. All accurate descriptions, all really shades and variations of the same thing. These are unauthorized souls that are here until the time of their torment, like they described to Jesus Christ. And they asked him, "Are you here ahead of the time of ahead of the appointed time to torment us?" And he said, "No. There is an appointed time for their torment, and that is not now. But it is rapidly approaching. You probably sense that." So, again, if you want to bridge the gap and kind of avoid all of this maelstrom that you find yourself in, you can do two things in the next couple of seconds. One, you can give yourself the peace of Christ, and two, you can save your immortal soul by checking into the name that's already written in the book of life. It's like checking into a hotel. It's like, yep, here we are. We've had reservations, and now we're coming in to take our room. And that is by accepting Christ as your Savior. And you do that by knowing that Christ is the Son of God, that he was offered as a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, as remittance for your sin, and that belief in that, and the fact that Christ rose 3 days later as a testament to the fact that you also could have life after death. If you believe that, and even if you preferentially desire it to be true, you can make moves that you can make that leap of faith and say that you believe it. And the next thing you know, you have bridged that huge gap, and you have taken on the peace of Christ, which is just sort of a sense of safety and security that you can make yourself aware of and you can use to kind of get through the stressful times in life. And also, more importantly, you got a room at the inn. You know, that all this evil crap that's going on now will mean nothing to you. You won't even remember it in the afterlife. All of the evil things and all the terrible things that you've done and that have been done to you and that you've witnessed, all that will be burned away. And it'll have no meaning or use or even relevance in the hereafter, because those things are temporal things here to give you the space to make a decision based on preference, whether you want to be with God or without him in outer darkness, right? Outer darkness being a small description in word terms for a great expanse of nothingness, which, you know, that is really what evil is. It's the absence of God. And the more people have an absence of God in themselves and in their lives, the more evil they are or act. You don't want to find yourself there. Not at all. Where you want to find yourself is forever free. And freedom is an internal action. It happens in your mind. All of the greatest writers about freedom will tell you this, that freedom occurs from the neck up, inside. It's a decision. And then once you make that decision with God and with Jesus Christ, with the Spirit of God and with the Player's Handbook, the Bible, you find yourself suddenly insulated from the deeper concerns, because that space has been filled. And you'll feel it immediately. You'll immediately feel something. I've heard it described as funny or different or lighter. And you are literally in that moment becoming the being you were meant to be. You are literally taking on the room given to you in the book of life. And that space is being filled by the Spirit of God. And not just the Spirit he gave you to create your soul and to give life and light to your body, but now a new spirit and an eternal spirit that is eternally yours, that you will carry forever. So that is what being born again means. For anybody who's confused about it, it's simply, in the most simplistic sense, it's just taking on what is already yours. It's accepting a gift that you've been given well before you were born. There are many references to the ocean being similar to, or even a reflection of, the judgment of God. And I haven't really even fully explored this myself, but some of the things I can take away immediately are the depth of the ocean, which to me is both, the weight of it is crushing, right? I mean, it'll crush, it'll compress iron and steel and make those things smaller, if it goes deep enough, right? But it's also like incredibly patient, right? It doesn't take the land away. And, while it might reach onto shore sometimes, and in some ways with devastating effect, it's always there, and yet, unless you engage it, it really has no effect on you. Now, if you're traveling through it, like the ships at sea, and you are risking peril, that's another story, right? All of these things are very similar to the way God is. He's got this huge amount of patience. And when he acts suddenly, like a powerful wave, and is irresistible in the same sense as a tsunami. And something that is essential for life can also become probably the most destructive force we know. So I think if you want to escape God's wrath, or that powerful wave coming towards us, take a look at whether or not you've come to a place where you can make a decision about your preference about God. Because preference comes before faith. Faith comes before your knowledge, and then that's where you really start to understand the Bible and get into things like the book of Proverbs and all the prophets and the New and Old Testament. And suddenly all these things are unlocked for you, because one of the things you gain once you become saved is the ability to use the player's handbook correctly. God will not allow you to understand the Bible properly unless you are truly saved. So if you meet somebody who's like a pastor who doesn't really seem like they know what they're talking about, they don't really have faith. No matter what they say, they don't really have faith. So if they're coming on TV and telling you about how you need to give them money so you can be saved, they are not Christians. They are not people using the Bible correctly. Faith doesn't cost money, and your salvation is free. It's already been given to you. All you have to do is say, yeah, I'll take it. It's a gift left at your door. All you got to do is open the door, take the gift into your home, and unpack it. There's no money involved. There's no transaction. It's just preference. So if you want to avoid that judgment, that incoming wave, seek higher ground.